The hall shimmered with gold light, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses echoing off marble floors. Waiters moved quietly through the crowd carrying trays of sparkling drinks. It was the kind of evening where people dressed not just to impress, but to prove their place in the world. Amid the crowd of polished shoes and designer gowns stood a woman who didn't quite belong there, at least not in the way others did. Her name was Maya. She wasn't wearing a gown from a famous label or jewelry that caught the light every time she moved. Her dress was simple, her hair tied neatly at the back, and her smile, that genuine kind that comes from the heart, was the only thing shining on her. She had been invited to the charity gala by a friend who believed in her work. Maya ran a small organization that helped underprivileged children learn basic computer skills and find confidence in their abilities. Her project wasn't big, but it was honest. Every cent that came in was used for the children. Every success story meant something real to her. As she looked around the hall, she couldn't help but notice how different she felt. The people here talked about luxury holidays, cars, and investment portfolios. They spoke of charity as though it was a fashionable thing, something that looked good in magazines. Maya quietly sipped her drink, thinking how strange it was that helping people had become part of a social competition. That's when she heard a deep voice behind her. "You're Maya, right? The one running that kid's project?" She turned and saw a tall man in a sharp black suit. His expression was confident, maybe too confident. He had the air of someone used to being listened to, the kind of man who could silence a room with just a glance. "Yes, that's me," Maya said politely, smiling. "And you are?" "Richard Cole," he said, extending his hand. "I run Cole Industries. We sponsor events like these." She shook his hand. His grip was firm, his gaze direct. There was something cold behind his smile, though, something that made Maya uneasy. "I've heard of your company," she said. "You do real estate and energy, right?" "Among other things," he replied. "I believe in building things that last." "That's a good way to look at it," Maya said softly. He studied her for a moment, as if trying to figure out what she was doing in this room full of millionaires. "So tell me," he said, "how much money do you actually make from your little project?" The question hit her like a slap. It wasn't the words themselves, but the tone. Sharp, dismissive, almost mocking. Maya took a slow breath. "It's not about how much money I make. It's about what difference it makes in the lives of those children." Richard chuckled lightly, swirling the drink in his hand. "That's a nice sentiment, but good intentions don't keep the lights on, do they? You can't change the world with feelings. You need capital." For a second, Maya didn't say anything. She just looked at him, really looked at him. This man who believed that success could be counted in numbers and zeros. Around them, the music played softly. People laughed. And yet there was a silence between them that seemed to stretch for miles. "You might be right," she said quietly, "but I've seen things that money can't buy. Children smiling because they finally believe they can do something. Parents crying because their child just learned to read. Those moments, they don't have a price." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Sounds poetic, but let's be real. Without people like me, people with money, you wouldn't even have that project. You need funding to survive, don't you?" Maya nodded. "Yes, but that doesn't mean I have to bow down to arrogance to get it." That made him pause. His lips curved into a small smirk. "You've got a fire in you," he said. "I like that. But fire burns out without fuel." "Maybe," she said, her voice calm. "But I'd rather burn out with purpose than live without one." Before he could respond, someone called his name from across the room. Another business partner, perhaps, or someone eager to impress him. Richard gave Maya a last look, half amusement, half curiosity, then walked away. Maya stood there for a moment, the sound of his expensive shoes fading behind her. She felt a strange mix of anger and sadness. People like Richard didn't understand. They lived in a world where worth was measured by power, where compassion was seen as weakness. She stepped out to the balcony to breathe. The city lights below looked like stars that had fallen to earth. She leaned on the railing and closed her eyes for a moment, thinking about all the kids back at her small learning center. The laughter, the curiosity, the joy in their faces when they learned something new. That was her world. That was what mattered. Inside, Richard was surrounded by people who laughed too easily and nodded too quickly. But his mind, strangely, was still on the woman in the simple dress who had dared to talk back to him. He wasn't used to that. Usually when he spoke, people listened or pretended to. He had built his empire from nothing, fought his way through business wars, and now he was sitting at the top. But there was something about her words that bothered him. "I'd rather burn out with purpose than live without one." It sounded ridiculous, but it stuck in his mind. Later that evening, as the event went on, Maya gave a short speech about her project. She didn't have slides or flashy visuals. She just spoke from her heart, about the children who dreamed of becoming teachers, doctors, and engineers, about how a small effort could light up a future. Her voice was calm but filled with quiet strength. The audience listened, some politely, some distractedly, but a few were deeply moved. Even Richard, standing in the back with his glass of champagne, found himself oddly silent. When she finished, a light applause followed. She smiled, bowed her head slightly, and stepped off the stage. A woman approached her, someone from another charity, and said, "That was beautiful. Maya, you spoke with so much heart." "Thank you," she said softly. "I just want people to see what I see, that these kids are not hopeless. They just need a chance." As the night went on, a few people came forward offering to connect her with potential sponsors. She thanked them sincerely, but she knew most of them would forget about it by morning. Still, she left that night feeling proud. She had spoken her truth. Meanwhile, Richard left the gala with an unreadable expression. In the back of his car, he sat quietly, staring out the window. His driver asked if everything was all right, but he didn't respond right away. He kept thinking about Maya's words, her tone, her calmness. He couldn't understand why it got under his skin. Maybe because she had something he didn't, something he couldn't buy. He shook his head and muttered, "Idealists never last." But somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was wrong. That night, Maya returned to her small apartment. The lights flickered a bit, the old wiring again, but she didn't mind. She sat by her desk, opened her worn-out notebook, and began writing ideas for the next month's workshops. She smiled, remembering the faces of her students. One of them, a boy named Aiden, had told her last week, "Miss, one day I'm going to build an app that helps people like me." That memory warmed her heart. She wrote beside his name, "Never stop dreaming." Outside, the city buzzed with life. Cars, lights, voices, but in that tiny apartment there was peace. At the same time, in a luxurious penthouse across town, Richard stood by his window staring at the same city. Everything he owned sparkled, glass, steel, and silence. Yet somehow it all felt a little empty tonight. He poured himself another drink and told himself it didn't matter. But when he looked out again, all he could see was the reflection of a woman with kind eyes and an unshakable spirit saying, "You can have money, but you'll never have my passion." He smiled faintly, not out of arrogance this time, but out of curiosity. For the first time in a long time, he wanted to understand what it meant to live for something other than success. And far away, Maya looked out her small window, unaware that her simple honesty had just shaken the confidence of a man who thought he had everything. The night grew quiet. Two very different souls living in two very different worlds were now connected by a single conversation, one that neither of them would ever forget. The next few weeks passed quickly for Maya. Her small learning center had become busier than ever. The children came every afternoon, their laughter filling the tiny rooms that smelled faintly of chalk and warm tea. The walls were covered with colorful drawings, little dreams made by small hands, rockets, computers, happy families. Every time Maya stepped inside, she felt alive again. This was her world, far away from the fancy halls and the people who looked at her like she didn't belong. Here, she didn't need to prove herself. She just needed to keep the lights on and the smiles coming. But even as she worked, she couldn't quite forget that night at the gala. The way Richard had looked at her, so sure of himself, so untouched by feeling. His words had bothered her, not because they hurt, but because they reminded her how people like him thought. That money meant power, and power meant importance. She shook the thought away and went back to her routine. The next big challenge was coming up. The education grant meeting. It was a chance for small organizations to present their work in front of wealthy investors and foundations. Winning that grant could help her center survive another year. Her team worked day and night, preparing slides, writing reports, and practicing her speech. She was nervous but hopeful. She believed that if she could just make them understand her vision, they would see why her project mattered. The day of the presentation arrived. The event was held in a glass-walled conference building downtown, modern, cold, and full of people in suits. Maya wore her same simple dress, cleanly pressed, with her hair tied neatly. She carried her old laptop and a folder full of reports. When she entered the main hall, her heart skipped a beat. Sitting at the head of the long table was Richard Cole. She froze for a second, unsure what to do. She hadn't known he was one of the main investors behind the education grant. For a moment she considered walking out, but then she took a deep breath. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here for her kids. Richard saw her too. His expression didn't change, but his eyes followed her as she took her seat among the other presenters. The meeting began. One by one, different organizations stood up to speak, talking about their plans, showing data, and making promises. Some of them had huge budgets and well-polished presentations. When it was Maya's turn, she stood up slowly, holding her notes close. Her voice trembled slightly at first, but then it steadied. She spoke about her center, about the children who came there after school because they had nowhere else to go. She told stories, real ones, about small victories like a shy girl who learned to type her first sentence, or a boy who built a small website by himself. She didn't talk in big words or use fancy slides. She spoke like someone who had seen the struggle and believed change was still possible. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. Some people nodded politely. A few smiled. Then Richard leaned back in his chair and said, "That was touching, Miss Maya, but tell me, if emotions could solve problems, we'd have no problems left. What's your actual plan for scalability? How do you plan to grow beyond this?"
Sentimental success?
The tone in his voice was calm but sharp. It wasn't curiosity. It was challenge. Maya looked at him and replied, "We grow by building trust. By showing the community what's possible when people care." Richard gave a half smile. "That's not a plan. That's a dream." The room went quiet again. Some of the other investors shifted uncomfortably. Maya could feel her face flush, but she didn't back down. "With respect, Mr. Cole," she said, "dreams are where plans begin. Without them, no one dares to start." He tilted his head slightly, watching her.
And when the dream fails?
He asked. "Then we start again," she said simply. "Because giving up is the one thing these kids can't afford to see." There was something in her tone that made the others turn toward her. The calmness in her voice carried more weight than the numbers in any chart. The moderator cleared his throat and moved to the next presentation. But Richard's eyes stayed on her a little longer. After the meeting ended, people began to leave the room. Maya packed her things quietly, unsure whether to feel proud or defeated. She had spoken her truth, but she knew men like Richard didn't value truth. They valued results. Just as she was about to leave, she heard his voice again. "Maya," he said, walking toward her. She turned around, keeping her expression neutral. "You did well," he said. "But passion alone isn't enough to win investors. You need structure, strategy, and financial sense." "I understand," she said softly. "But I'm not trying to win investors. I'm trying to win chances, and for children who've never had one." He studied her for a moment, his brow slightly furrowed. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I don't just believe it," she said. "I live it." There was silence again. Then he smiled, that same confident smile she'd seen before. "You have courage. I'll give you that." She gave a small nod. "And you have influence. Maybe one day you'll use it for something that matters." Her words were gentle, but they landed heavy. He didn't respond, just watched as she turned and walked out of the building. Outside, the air felt cooler, freer. Maya took a deep breath, looking up at the sky. She didn't know if she'd get the grant, but she felt something even stronger. The quiet power of standing her ground. Inside, Richard watched her leave from the window. He didn't know why he felt unsettled. He had faced tougher negotiators in boardrooms, but no one had ever spoken to him like that. Calm, firm, and unafraid. Later that night, while reviewing the meeting notes with his assistant, he paused when her name appeared on the list. "Remove that one," he said at first. Too small, too emotional, but then he stopped. "Actually, keep it for review." His assistant looked surprised but nodded. Over the next few days, he found himself thinking about her again, about her steady eyes and her quiet conviction. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. Yet for reasons he couldn't explain, he asked his team to pull up her project details. He learned that her organization ran on donations from local families and teachers. Her salary was almost nothing. Most of her work was voluntary, yet the results were real. Test scores improving, kids finding new confidence. He sat back in his chair, staring at the report. There was no fancy branding, no expensive campaign. Just heart. Meanwhile, Maya's team waited anxiously for the results of the grant. Days turned into weeks. Bills piled up. The landlord had already warned her about the rent. She tried to keep smiling for the children, but the worry sat heavy inside her. One afternoon, as she was helping a group of students with a small project, a volunteer rushed in with a letter. "Maya, it's from the grant committee." She wiped her hands and opened it carefully. Her eyes moved over the words slowly, almost afraid to read them. Then she smiled. They hadn't given her the full funding, but they had approved a partial grant, enough to keep the center running for another 6 months. Everyone cheered. The kids clapped, not even knowing exactly what had happened, only that their teacher was happy. That night, after everyone had gone home, Maya sat alone, looking at the letter again. Her eyes stopped on one line at the bottom. "Special recommendation, Mr. Richard Cole." She leaned back in her chair, a soft smile touching her lips. So he had been listening after all. But she didn't dwell on it. Gratitude, yes, but not dependence. She knew people like him acted out of pride more than compassion. Still, maybe there was something more to him than what she'd seen that night at the gala. Across town, in his quiet office, Richard sat by the window once again. He thought of her expression, calm but unbreakable. He had helped her not because he pitied her, but because something about her made him question his own values. He realized that for all his power, there were things he didn't understand, things that money couldn't teach. He had spent his whole life building walls made of wealth and pride. And yet one woman's honesty had left a crack in that wall, a small, unexpected light shining through. He didn't know it yet, but that light would soon grow stronger. And Maya, unaware of how deeply she had stirred his thoughts, went to bed that night feeling hopeful, ready to face another day with the same belief that had carried her this far, that passion was her greatest strength, and no amount of money could ever replace it. The rain had been falling all morning, tapping softly on the tin roof of the small learning center. Inside, Maya sat at her desk surrounded by files and notebooks. A small heater hummed in the corner, and the children's laughter from the next room echoed faintly through the thin walls. She should have been happy. The partial grant had kept the center alive, at least for a while. But lately, new problems had begun to rise. Donations had slowed down, and a few of her volunteers had to leave to find paying jobs. The bills were starting to pile up again, and the roof had begun to leak in one corner. Still, Maya kept smiling. She had learned to find strength in the little things, the smile of a child who had just learned something new, the gratitude in a parent's eyes, the warmth of the community that believed in her. Those things mattered more than money. That afternoon, as she was helping one of the children fix a computer that had stopped working, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Hello?" she said. "Miss Maya?" A man's voice replied. "This is from the City Business Council. You've been shortlisted for a community partnership program. Would you be available to meet the board tomorrow?" Her heart lifted. "Yes, of course," she said, her voice almost trembling. "Good," the man said. "The meeting will be at the council building at 10 a.m. Mr. Richard Cole will also be present." Her smile faded just a little. She hadn't expected to hear that name again. After the call ended, she sat there for a while thinking. It wasn't that she feared him, but every time their paths crossed, she felt like it was another test. Still, she reminded herself, this was a chance to grow her project. She had to try. The next morning, she arrived at the tall glass building downtown. She felt small standing in the grand lobby, surrounded by people in expensive clothes. She straightened her simple jacket and walked up to the receptionist. Moments later, she was led into a conference room where several business leaders sat, including Richard. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. "Good morning," she said softly, taking her seat. The meeting began. They discussed community development plans, potential partnerships, and funding models. Maya listened carefully, noting how easily they spoke about numbers that could change hundreds of lives. Yet to them it was just business talk. When it was her turn to speak, she explained how local companies could support skill-based learning programs. She spoke about building bridges between the wealthy and the working class, about giving people a sense of purpose rather than just aid. Her voice was calm, confident. When she finished, Richard leaned forward slightly. "You're asking for long-term collaboration," he said. "That means accountability. What assurance can we have that your center won't collapse in a year?" Maya looked at him steadily. "No one can promise the future, Mr. Cole, but I can promise effort, honesty, and the belief that every single child we help is worth it." A few people smiled at her answer. Richard didn't. He tapped his pen on the table, thinking, "Effort and honesty don't balance ledgers," he said finally. "And ledgers," she replied quietly, "don't measure hope." The room went silent. One of the board members cleared his throat and changed the subject, but everyone could feel the tension. When the meeting ended, some of the members approached Maya privately to thank her. One woman whispered, "You remind me why I started doing this work in the first place." Maya smiled warmly, then gathered her things and left the room. As she walked toward the elevator, she heard footsteps behind her. It was Richard. "You really don't know when to stop challenging me, do you?" he said, half amused. She turned to face him. "I don't challenge you, Mr. Cole. I challenge what you stand for." He tilted his head. "And what do I stand for, according to you?" "Power without empathy," she said simply. "Success without purpose." He stared at her for a moment, caught off guard by the calmness in her tone. "You think I don't care?" "I think you've forgotten how," she replied. "Maybe once you did. But now you just count things that can be bought." He didn't respond immediately. There was something in her words that hit deeper than he wanted to admit. "Maya," he said finally, "you talk like passion can solve everything, but passion doesn't pay for buildings or teachers or electricity." "You'll learn that soon," she smiled gently. "And you talk like money can solve everything." "You'll learn that soon too." For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she pressed the elevator button, stepped inside, and the doors closed between them. That evening, back at the center, she told her small team about the meeting. They listened quietly. One of the volunteers, an older man who had been with her since the beginning, sighed. "You're brave, Maya," he said, "but people like him hold the keys to everything." "Then we'll build our own doors," she said. Everyone laughed softly, though they all knew how hard that would be. Over the next month, the struggle grew harder. The grant money began to run out and more bills came in. She reached out to local businesses, but few replied. Some promised to consider it later. Others just ignored her messages. Still, she refused to give up. She organized small community events, asking parents and neighbors to help however they could. Sometimes they brought food for the kids, sometimes old computers. Slowly, bit by bit, they kept things running. One afternoon, as she was setting up a class, she received an email from the council. The partnership program had been postponed indefinitely. No explanation. Her heart sank. She knew what that meant. Someone higher up had withdrawn support. Later that night, after everyone left, she sat alone under the dim light of the center. The rain had started again, dripping through the crack in the roof. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her cup of tea. She didn't cry. She was too tired for tears. But for the first time, she wondered if maybe Richard had been right. Maybe passion wasn't enough. Meanwhile, Richard sat in his office staring at a proposal on his desk, the same program Maya had worked for. He had the final say in whether it went ahead. His advisors had recommended focusing on projects with higher financial returns. Supporting a small community center didn't fit the company's goals. He signed the papers, setting the project aside. But as he leaned back, something in him felt uneasy. He remembered her eyes, and steady, honest, unafraid. He remembered the way she spoke about children as if they were treasures, not statistics. That night, he couldn't sleep. He turned on the TV, flipped through channels, then finally switched it off. The silence of his apartment felt heavier than usual. The next morning, he arrived at his office early. Instead of diving into meetings, he told his assistant to clear his schedule. Then, without telling anyone, he drove across the city to Maya's neighborhood. It was his first time seeing the place in daylight. Narrow streets, small shops, children running barefoot. He parked a few blocks away and walked toward the center. Through the window, he saw her sitting with the kids, helping them type on old keyboards. Her smile was soft and patient. Even the broken furniture and peeling walls couldn't dull the warmth of that room. He stood there for a while, unnoticed. Something in his chest tightened. When Maya finally saw him at the door, she looked surprised but not angry. "You found us," she said quietly. "I wanted to see what you built," he said, stepping inside. "You weren't exaggerating." "No," she said, "I wasn't." He looked around. The mismatched chairs, the faded posters, the computers that looked older than some of the children. "You're really doing all this on donations?" "Mostly," she said. "And on faith," he nodded slowly. "Faith doesn't make profit." "Maybe not," she said, "but it makes people try." A small boy tugged at Maya's sleeve. "Teacher, can you help me?" he asked shyly. She smiled and knelt beside him. Of course, Richard watched quietly. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. "If you ever need something, equipment maybe, or a better space, call this number." Maya looked at the card, then at him. "Are you doing this out of guilt?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then said, "Maybe out of respect." She nodded, slipping the card into her folder. "Thank you. But I won't ask for what I don't earn." He gave a faint smile. "You're the most stubborn person I've ever met." "Maybe that's why I'm still here," she said, turning back to the children. As he left, the sound of laughter followed him down the street. For the first time in a long time, he felt something real, something that had nothing to do with business or reputation. That night, he sat in his car outside his apartment for a long time, watching the rain slide down the windshield. He realized that in trying to teach her a lesson about power, he had ended up learning one about purpose. And back at the center, Maya closed up for the night, unaware that her quiet persistence had just begun to change the heart of a man who once believed money could buy everything. Weeks turned into months, and the small learning center continued to fight its quiet battles. The old computers still blinked with tired screens, the paint still peeled off the walls, and the rent notice still hung by the office door. But despite it all, the sound of laughter never stopped echoing inside those walls. Maya had learned to survive on faith, but more than that, she had learned to inspire others with it. Every day she arrived early to prepare lessons, arrange the books, and make sure the children had something warm to drink when they came in. Her friends often told her she was working too hard, that she should take a break. But she always smiled and said, "When you love something, it doesn't tire you and it feeds you." Still, deep down, she knew the struggle was far from over. She needed more help, not just donations, but people who believed in what she was doing. People who could see the vision the way she did. One cold morning, as she was cleaning the classroom, a delivery truck stopped in front of the building. A man stepped out holding a clipboard. "Are you Maya?" he asked. "Yes," she said, confused. "These are for you," he said, pointing to several large boxes being unloaded. "What is this?" she asked, walking closer. The man smiled. "Computers. Brand new ones. From Coal Industries." Maya froze for a moment. Her heart jumped, but she quickly tried to steady herself. "There must be some mistake," she said. "We didn't order these." "No mistake," the man said. "Everything's been cleared and paid for. Here's the paperwork." He handed her the document, and there it was. Her center's name, her address, and at the bottom, a small note. "For the children who believe they can." RC, she didn't know what to say. For a moment, she just stood there staring at the boxes as the children began to gather around, eyes wide with excitement. "Teacher, are these for us?" one of them shouted. "Yes," she said softly, her voice trembling just a little. "They're for you." The kids cheered, jumping and clapping, their joy filling the entire room. Maya smiled through her surprise. She knew exactly who had sent them, but she also knew she couldn't let that change her focus. That afternoon, as the children tried the new computers, she stood quietly in a corner, watching them. For the first time in months, she didn't have to worry about broken keyboards or flickering screens. The air was lighter, the laughter louder. Later that evening, when everyone left, she sat down and looked again at the small note. Part of her wanted to call him and thank him, but another part hesitated. She didn't want him to think she owed him anything. Still, she couldn't ignore what he'd done, so she wrote a short email. "Thank you for your kindness. The children are happy and their smiles are priceless. I hope one day you'll visit and see it for yourself. She pressed send and closed her laptop. Across the city, in a tall glass office, Richard opened his inbox late at night and saw her message. A small smile appeared on his face. He hadn't done it for thanks. At least that's what he told himself. But hearing from her made something inside him soften. He read her message twice, then replied, "I'm glad they're useful. Maybe I will visit." He didn't send it right away. He stared at the screen for a while, then finally pressed send and leaned back in his chair. The next week, true to his word, he visited. When he arrived, the children were in the middle of a class. Maya looked up, surprised but calm. "You really did come," she said, wiping her hands on a cloth. "I said I might," he replied with a faint smile. "I wanted to see how things are going." The kids noticed him almost immediately. One of them whispered, "Is he the man who sent the computers?" Maya nodded. "Yes, he is." The children rushed up to him, full of excitement. They wanted to show him what they'd learned, the typing games, the small projects they were working on. Their energy was contagious. Even Richard, who had spent his life in rooms full of silence and calculation, couldn't help but laugh. He knelt beside one of the kids who proudly showed him a simple drawing made with a computer mouse. "That's amazing," he said. The boy grinned. "I'm going to make video games one day." For a moment, something softened in Richard's face. The boy's confidence, his sparkle. It reminded him of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. After the class, Maya offered him tea. They sat near the window where the afternoon light poured in. The walls were still old, but the atmosphere was full of life. "I see now," he said quietly. "This place isn't just a school. It's a family." "That's what I try to make it," she said. "Many of these kids don't have anyone else cheering for them. So we do." He nodded, staring into his cup. "You were right about something," he said after a pause. "Money can buy things. But not what I saw in there." She looked at him. "It's never too late to learn that." He smiled faintly. "I'm starting to." Over the next few weeks, Richard began visiting more often. Sometimes he brought supplies. Sometimes he just came to listen. The children liked him, and even the volunteers warmed up to him. He asked questions about the programs, took notes, and even helped fix a broken table one day. People in the community began to notice his visits. Some were skeptical at first, wondering if he was doing it for publicity, but he never brought cameras or reporters. He came quietly and left quietly, and slowly something in him began to change. For years he had measured life in profits, contracts, and numbers, but now he found himself thinking about things that couldn't be counted: kindness, laughter, connection. One evening, as he walked out of the center, he stopped by the park across the street and sat on a bench. The sunset painted the sky in soft orange light. He watched the children play, their joy unshaken by the world around them. He realized that Maya had something he had never known he was missing: peace. The next day, he called his board and made a decision that surprised everyone. He wanted to start a new division in his company, a social development branch that supported education projects like Maya's across the city. His advisors questioned him. "It's not profitable," one of them said. "I know," he replied. "But it's meaningful." For once, no one argued further. There was something different in his voice, something firm and certain. A week later, he returned to Maya's center with the news. When he told her, she was stunned. "You're starting a social program?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "and I'd like your help shaping it." She blinked in surprise. "You want me to work with you?" "I want to learn from you," he said simply. She laughed softly. "That's a first," he smiled. "I guess we've both changed a little." They began meeting regularly, sometimes at his office, sometimes at the center. Together, they designed a plan to bring computer literacy programs to other low-income areas. Maya focused on the community side, while Richard handled logistics and funding. It wasn't always easy. They argued sometimes, mostly because they came from such different worlds. But beneath the disagreements, there was growing respect, and something deeper neither of them said out loud. One afternoon, after finishing a long meeting, Richard looked at Maya and said, "You were right that day at the gala." She raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "You told me I had money but no passion," she smiled. "And now?" He looked at her for a long moment. Now I'm trying to find it. For the first time, she saw something truly different in his eyes. Not arrogance, not pride, but sincerity. Months later, when the first new learning center opened in another neighborhood, both of them stood side by side at the ribbon cutting. The children's laughter filled the air again, just like it did in Maya's old center. As the crowd applauded, Maya glanced at Richard and said quietly, "You see, this is what passion builds." He nodded, smiling. "And maybe this is what money is meant for." They didn't say much after that, but they didn't need to. The moment spoke for itself. That evening, as Maya walked home, she felt lighter than she had in years. She thought about how strange life could be, how one argument, one unexpected meeting could change everything. And somewhere across town, in his high-rise apartment, Richard stood by the window looking at the city lights. But this time the view felt different. The lights didn't just remind him of success, then they reminded him of people, of lives being touched, of small centers filled with laughter. He realized he had spent years chasing greatness when all along, what he needed was goodness. And in that quiet moment, both of them, miles apart but connected by purpose, knew that something had shifted forever. Months passed, and the city began to notice something new. Small learning centers were appearing in different corners of the neighborhoods that once felt forgotten. They were not fancy buildings, but they were full of life. Children sat around glowing computer screens, learning, laughing, and dreaming a little bigger each day. Maya often visited each one, helping teachers get settled, encouraging the students, and reminding them that even the smallest start could lead to something great. Everywhere she went, she saw a piece of the same spark she had once fought to protect in her own little center. And every time she saw it, she thought of Richard. He had become a quieter man, still confident but not arrogant. The same person who once mocked her passion now spent his days listening to others, teachers, volunteers, children, and trying to understand how he could help. He no longer walked into a room expecting everyone to listen to him. Now he walked in hoping to learn. One afternoon he visited Maya's original center again. It had been painted recently, and the walls were now covered with bright drawings made by the children. Maya was sitting on the floor helping a little girl spell her name on a piece of paper when she saw him standing at the door. "You're early," she said with a smile, standing up. "I couldn't wait," he replied. "I just came from the new center across town. It's incredible, Maya, you'd be proud." "I already am," she said. "But you should be too." He shook his head. "It wasn't me. It was everyone who believed in this." "Including you," she laughed softly. "Belief doesn't come easy to everyone." "It didn't to me," he admitted. "But I'm learning." The children waved at him and he waved back. He stayed for a while, helping them with a few tasks, laughing when one of them asked if he was a teacher now. "Not yet," he said, smiling. "But maybe one day." Later, as the sun began to set, the two of them stood outside the center, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. "It's hard to believe how much has changed," she said quietly. "It's because you refuse to give up," he replied. She looked at him thoughtfully. "No, it's because you finally decided to believe in something that wasn't just about you." He smiled. "Maybe that's the same thing." A few weeks later, there was another charity event, the same kind of gala where they had first met. Only this time, the atmosphere was different. The people were different. It wasn't about wealth or reputation anymore. It was about change. Maya didn't plan to attend at first. She didn't like those grand events, the lights or the polished speeches. But Richard insisted. "You should be there," he said. "You're the reason this all started." So she agreed reluctantly. That night, the hall was filled with guests, community leaders, teachers, and people who had helped support the new centers. There was a stage at the front, and banners showing pictures of the children learning in the classrooms. As Maya walked in, people smiled at her, some even thanking her. She felt a little uncomfortable with the attention, but she stayed calm and gracious. When it was time for the speeches, Richard took the stage. The lights dimmed slightly and all eyes turned to him. He stood there quietly for a moment before speaking. "A year ago," he began, "I attended a similar event in a hall just like this. Back then I thought I understood what power meant. I thought it meant having control, having money, and being right." There was a soft murmur in the crowd. He continued, "But then someone challenged me. She told me that I might have money, but I would never have her passion. At that moment, I thought she was being foolish. Now I know she was the only one in that room telling the truth. The audience listened closely. Maya sat near the middle, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on him. She was right, he said, his voice steady but full of emotion. Passion builds what money can't. It gives life meaning. It brings people together. It creates something real, and I had to lose my pride to see it. He paused, looking around the room. I stand here today not as someone who built these learning centers, but as someone who was changed by them. Because of Maya and the children she never stopped believing in, I learned that success isn't measured by what you have. It's measured by what you give. The hall went silent for a moment, and then the applause began, soft at first, then louder, filling the space until it echoed. Maya didn't stand up or wave. She just smiled, her eyes warm but calm. She wasn't the kind of person who wanted credit. All she ever wanted was for people to understand why passion mattered. After the event, many people came to greet her. Some asked for advice, others offered help or donations. But when the room finally began to empty, Richard found her standing near the exit, quietly sipping water. "You didn't tell me you were going to say all that," she said, half smiling. "I didn't plan to," he replied. "It just felt right." She nodded. "You spoke well." He looked at her thoughtfully. "You know, I've made a lot of speeches in my life, but that's the first one that actually meant something." They both laughed softly. Outside, the night air was cool. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement as cars passed by. They walked together for a while without saying anything, just listening to the sounds of the city. Finally, Maya said, "Do you ever miss your old life?" He thought for a moment. "Sometimes," he admitted. "The comfort, the control, the feeling that I was always winning." He smiled faintly. "But then I remember how empty it felt, and I wouldn't trade what I have now for any of it." "What do you have now?" she asked. He looked at her. "Purpose," she nodded slowly. "That's a good thing to have." "It is," he said quietly. "And it's all because of you." Maya shook her head. "No, Richard. You found it yourself. I just reminded you it was there." He smiled, understanding what she meant. They stopped near the edge of the street, where the view opened up to the river. The lights reflected beautifully on the water. "You know," he said, "when you told me that night at the gala that I'd never have your passion, it stayed with me. It bothered me at first, but now I think it saved me." She smiled softly. "Maybe it saved both of us." They stood there for a while, watching the city together. Two very different people, once divided by pride and perspective, now connected by something much stronger, shared purpose and mutual respect. The next day, Maya was back at the center as usual. The children greeted her with their usual excitement. She helped one of them with a math problem, then showed another how to draw a heart on the computer screen. As she watched them, she realized that this, the small victories, the laughter, the dreams, was what all the work was for. A few hours later, she got a message from Richard. It was short but heartfelt. "Thank you for reminding me what life really means. Passion is the one thing that makes everything else worth it." She smiled, set down her phone, and went back to her work. Outside, the sky was turning gold again, just like the day she first met him. Only now, everything was different. The world felt a little kinder, a little more open. As the day ended, she sat by the window and looked out at the children still playing outside. Her heart felt full, not because she had changed someone powerful, but because she had stayed true to herself. And somewhere across the city, a man who once believed money could buy everything sat at his desk, looking at a picture of a group of smiling children. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about deals or profits. He was thinking about people, and how one woman's courage had reminded him what it meant to live with purpose. He whispered to himself, almost like a quiet confession, "You have money, but you will never have my passion. Only now." He finally understood what those words truly meant. The world outside kept moving, busy and loud as always. But for those two souls, Maya and Richard, life had slowed into something beautiful, a story of belief, change, and the quiet victory of the human spirit. Because sometimes, all it takes is one brave voice to remind the world that true wealth isn't found in what you own. It's found in what you give, and the fire you carry in your heart. And that fire, once lit, never fades.